Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. What would drive millions of people to abandon their homes, families, and everything familiar to sail across a vast ocean toward a land they'd never seen? In the 19th century, America became more than just a place. It became a promise of freedom, of prosperity, of a fresh start. And for countless immigrants, that promise was worth risking everything. The 1800s saw an unprecedented wave of immigration to the United States. It was a century marked by both hope and hardship. From the famine-stricken hills of Ireland to the revolution-torn states of Germany, from the crowded cities of Italy to the rural villages of Eastern Europe and the distant provinces of China, people came in waves. Some were fleeing poverty or persecution. Others were chasing opportunity or answering the call of the American dream. Together, they reshaped the identity of a young and rapidly growing nation. This influx didn't just add numbers. It added cultures, traditions, languages, and tensions. It filled cities, built railroads, mined coal, and worked the factories that powered the Industrial Revolution. Immigrants laid bricks, sewed garments, and raised families in cramped tenements. They built communities within communities, Chinatowns, Little Italies, German districts, each a blend of Old World customs and New World adaptation. But the journey wasn't easy, and the reality often fell short of the dream. Many faced discrimination, exploitation, and violence. No Irish need apply signs weren't just rumors. They were reminders of the deep prejudice many newcomers encountered. Chinese laborers helped build the Transcontinental Railroad, only to be excluded and scapegoated. Eastern European Jews fled pogroms only to face anti-Semitism in their new homeland. Italians and Poles were often relegated to the lowest-paying, most dangerous jobs, regardless of their skills or ambitions. Still, despite the challenges, these immigrants left a lasting mark. Their influence is in the food we eat, the music we hear, the neighborhoods we walk through. They helped define what it means to be American, not just by adopting a new country, but by transforming it. In this video, we're going far beyond the textbook version of 19th century immigration. We're stepping into the shoes of those who left behind famine-stricken villages, war-torn landscapes, and crumbling economies, people who risked everything on the hope that America would be something better. We'll uncover the reasons why millions packed their lives into trunks and boarded crowded ships bound for a foreign land. We'll look at the journey itself, long, dangerous, and dehumanizing for many. Then we'll dig into the harsh realities waiting on the other side: tenement housing, factory labor, nativist hostility, and the constant fight to survive and belong in a country that didn't always welcome them. But we'll also celebrate what these immigrants built: neighborhoods, churches, labor unions, small businesses, entire communities that laid the groundwork for modern American cities and culture. This isn't just a story of hardship. It's a story of grit, of communities holding on to their roots while forging something entirely new. Because when we talk about 19th century immigration, we're not just talking about Ellis Island and steamboats. We're talking about how America was made. Not just by the founding fathers, but by millions of everyday people who brought their languages, their traditions, their labor, and their dreams, and in doing so, shaped the country in ways we still see today. To understand why millions uprooted their lives in the 19th century and set sail for America, we need to begin not with what they found in the New World, but what they left behind. The forces that drove people from their homelands were powerful and often devastating. These push factors were enough to shatter entire communities, making the gamble of an uncertain future across the ocean seem like the only hope. For the Irish, one word summed up their exodus: famine. The Great Irish Potato Famine, which began in 1845, wiped out the staple crop that fed millions. Families starved as British policies failed to respond adequately, and landowners continued to export food, while the people who harvested it died. By the end of the famine, over 1 million were dead, and at least another 1 million had fled, most to America. But starvation wasn't the only motivator. Across continental Europe, especially in the German states, Austria, and Hungary, the revolutions of 1848 erupted in a fiery attempt to bring about liberal reforms, freedom of speech, democratic governance, national unification. But these uprisings were crushed. Disillusioned political activists, scholars, and everyday workers fled persecution or imprisonment, finding refuge in the U.S. where they could start over, sometimes referred to as the 48ers. For many Eastern European Jews, life was shaped by constant fear. Pogroms, violent, government-condoned attacks on Jewish communities, were commonplace in Russia and the Pale of Settlement. Religious persecution forced entire families to abandon centuries-old roots in hopes of safety, freedom of worship, and a chance to live without fear. There was also a more subtle but no less potent force: the grinding poverty of the peasant class across southern and eastern Europe. In rural Italy, Poland, and the Balkans, families faced economic stagnation, high taxes, and land that could no longer sustain them. For these people, America wasn't just an escape. It was survival, but just as important as what pushed them out was what pulled them in. America, by the mid-1800s, had built a powerful myth, a land of limitless opportunity. Stories filtered back across the Atlantic about land for the taking, jobs for the willing, and streets paved with gold. The U.S. government encouraged this belief, especially with policies like the Homestead Act of 1862, which offered 160 acres of free land to settlers willing to work it. For many Europeans crushed by rigid class systems, this was nothing short of revolutionary. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution was roaring to life in American cities. Factories needed workers, lots of them. Immigrants were recruited to fill the swelling ranks of textile mills, steel plants, shipyards, and railroads. Job agents even traveled abroad to lure workers with promises of high wages and a better life. Many took the bait, dreaming of a few years of hard labor that could earn them enough to buy land or bring their families over. And then there was the idea, simple, powerful, and elusive, of the American dream. A belief that in America, anyone could succeed if they worked hard enough. For those born into rigid caste systems or authoritarian regimes, this dream was magnetic. It wasn't always real, but it was always real enough to inspire the journey. So they came, by the millions. Not because they were reckless or naive, but because they were brave. They believed that even with all the risks, the treacherous voyage, the unknown waiting on the other side, hope was still worth chasing. And for many, it was the beginning of something they had never truly known: choice, freedom, and a future that belonged to them. The journey to America in the 19th century was not a cruise. It was a test of endurance, faith, and survival. For most immigrants, traveling to the United States meant weeks trapped in the lowest section of a steamship, steerage class, a cramped, dark, and unsanitary space that often mirrored the very poverty they were fleeing. Steerage was essentially the cargo hold of the ship, hastily retrofitted to accommodate human beings. Hundreds of people, sometimes over 1,000, were packed shoulder to shoulder in narrow bunks stacked 3 high. There was no privacy, little ventilation, and only limited access to fresh water. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, waste, and seasickness. Toilet facilities, if they existed, were crude and food was basic, often a diet of hard biscuits, soup, and tea, served irregularly and in small portions. Disease thrived in these conditions. Typhus, cholera, and dysentery swept through steerage decks with deadly speed. Entire families could be wiped out before the ship reached American shores. Infants and the elderly were especially vulnerable, and burial at sea was a grim reality. Medical inspections were minimal, and those who fell ill were often quarantined or left untreated. The mortality rate, though not as high as during the ISC era of slave ships, was still significant. Some called these voyages coffin ships. The voyage itself typically lasted 2 to 6 weeks, depending on the ship, the weather, and the departure point. Steamships shortened the journey compared to the older sailing vessels, but the experience remained harrowing. Storms could batter the ship for days, tossing passengers around violently in their bunks. Seasickness was almost universal. The relentless rocking of the ship, the claustrophobic atmosphere, and the constant fear of illness created a psychological toll that wore down even the most determined travelers. But perhaps the deepest struggle was emotional. Saying goodbye to home wasn't always a choice. It was often a permanent farewell. Most immigrants knew they would never see their hometowns, or the loved ones they left behind, again. Entire villages would gather at ports to send off those, leaving for America, with tearful goodbyes and last embraces. The trauma of that separation lingered long after the ship pulled away from shore. On board, immigrants clung to their few possessions, photographs, religious items, family heirlooms, and leaned on each other for strength. The languages spoken in steerage were as diverse as the nations represented, but there was a shared sense of uncertainty. What would life be like in America? Would they be accepted? Would there be work? Would their children have a better future? For some, hope dimmed during the crossing. Others held tight to stories they had heard, of success, of freedom, of land and wages and respect. For all of them, the journey was a crucible. By the time they reached Ellis Island or Castle Garden, they had already survived a kind of trial. By fire. The sea had tested their resolve. What came next would test their resilience. The voyage to America wasn't just about miles traveled. It was a rite of passage, a painful, terrifying, and often dehumanizing experience. But at the end of it, if they were lucky, stood the first glimpse of a new world, a distant skyline, a torch held high in the harbor, and the fragile beginnings of a new life. After surviving the grueling voyage, immigrants finally caught sight of the American shoreline, often a hazy outline of buildings and masts on the horizon. For many arriving on the East Coast, the first recognizable landmark was the Statue of Liberty, her torch lifted high as if signaling a new beginning. It was a deeply emotional moment. Tears flowed, prayers were whispered, and passengers surged onto the deck just to glimpse the symbol of the freedom they had risked everything for. But even that moment of awe was quickly replaced by anxiety, because the journey wasn't over yet. Before they could set foot on American soil, they had to pass through immigration stations. For those who arrived before 1892, that meant Castle Garden, located at the southern tip of Manhattan. It served as the nation's first official immigration center, handling more than 8 million arrivals. After 1892, the system shifted to Ellis Island, a purpose-built facility just off the coast of New York City. It became the primary gateway to America, processing around 12 million immigrants until it closed in 1954. Those arriving on the West Coast, particularly from China, Japan, and the Philippines, passed through Angel Island, located in San Francisco Bay. Unlike Ellis Island, which was generally efficient and focused on rapid processing, Angel Island was more like a detention center, especially for Chinese immigrants, who faced long interrogations, racism, and exclusion under the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. For many Asian families, arrival in America began with rejection and suspicion rather than welcome. At Ellis Island, the process was clinical, intimidating, and sometimes humiliating. Immigrants filed through massive halls, clutching their papers, children, and whatever luggage they hadn't lost. They were given quick medical inspections, checked for visible signs of disease, limps, rashes, and eye conditions like trachoma. Those who didn't pass were marked with chalk symbols on their clothing and often pulled aside for further exams. A single diagnosis could mean deportation even after weeks at sea. Following the health check came the legal interview: names, occupations, reasons for coming, how much money they had. If a name was too difficult for the clerks to understand, or if it sounded foreign in a way that made them uncomfortable, it might be altered on the spot. Contrary to popular myth, officials didn't always arbitrarily rename people, but transcription errors and simplifications were common. The result was generations of families who lost a connection to their roots with the stroke of a pen. And yet, for those who passed, there was still the emotional impact of stepping into a vast, unfamiliar world. The streets were noisy, crowded, and unlike anything most had ever seen. Carts clattered down cobblestone roads, factory whistles blew from dawn to dusk, and people from every corner of the globe jostled through the city. Languages overlapped, advertisements shouted in English, and the skyline stretched upward with dizzying energy. Immigrants were awestruck by the sheer scale and pace of American life, but also deeply disoriented. The customs, the food, the dress, the tempo, it was overwhelming. Many who had never seen a train or a paved street found themselves trying to navigate a modern industrial city. Some were welcomed by family who had already settled. Others were entirely alone, forced to negotiate lodging, work, and survival on their own within hours of arrival. But no matter how tough the arrival was, one feeling dominated: relief. They had made it. The ocean was behind them. Ahead lay struggle, yes, but also possibility. This was America, and for better or worse, it was now home. Starting over in a strange land wasn't easy, but immigrants had little choice. With only a few coins in their pockets and often no English skills, they did what people have always done in times of uncertainty. They found their own. Ethnic enclaves began to spring up in every major city: Little Italy, Chinatown, Jewish quarters, Polish neighborhoods, and so on. These communities offered familiarity in a sea of chaos. Familiar languages, familiar smells from corner bakeries or street vendors, places of worship and mutual support. For many, these tight-knit neighborhoods were the only safety net in an overwhelming and often hostile new world. But these enclaves were not utopias. Most immigrants lived in tenement housing, cramped, poorly ventilated apartment buildings hastily constructed to house the exploding population of cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston. Families were often packed 5, 10, or more into single-room flats. Bathrooms, if they existed, were shared by multiple families on a floor. Windows were rare, light was dim, and sanitation was almost non-existent. Garbage piled up in alleyways. Disease spread quickly, and fires were a constant threat. The word tenement came to symbolize poverty and neglect, yet for millions it was the starting point of the American dream. To pay for even this squalor, everyone had to work, often immediately. Factory jobs were the lifeblood of immigrant survival. America's industrial boom was hungry for cheap labor, and immigrants were the perfect supply. They toiled in textile mills, steel plants, slaughterhouses, and coal mines. The work was long, 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week, and grueling. Conditions were dangerous. There were no safety regulations, no sick leave, no compensation. If you lost a limb to a machine or fell ill from toxic fumes, men weren't the only ones working. Women and children were also part of the labor force, often paid even less than their male counterparts. Children as young as 6 or 7 worked in garment factories, crawled into coal chutes, or sold newspapers on street corners just to help their families survive. Education took a backseat to survival. While reformers eventually pushed for child labor laws during much of the 19th century, childhood was a luxury most immigrant families couldn't afford. Even when they did find work, immigrants faced another harsh reality: exploitation. Factory owners and employers viewed them as disposable. They were paid pennies for backbreaking labor and constantly threatened with replacement if they complained. Language barriers made it easy to cheat them. Discrimination was common, both from bosses and from older, more established Americans, who saw these new arrivals as a threat to wages, culture, and public order. Despite the crowded tenements, the backbreaking labor, and the constant whispers that they didn't belong, immigrants kept going. They found strength in each other, in neighbors who spoke the same language, in churches that echoed with familiar hymns, in kitchens that smelled like home. They built networks of support through mutual aid societies, offering help when no one else would. They organized, protested, and fought for fair wages and safer working conditions, becoming a driving force in the labor movement. Education became a powerful tool of hope. Even when money was tight, parents sent their children to school, believing that maybe the next generation could climb higher. And through it all, they held fast to their cultural identities, passing down recipes, songs, and stories that gave them roots in a place that often made them feel uprooted. With every step forward, every business started, every vote cast, every child who graduated, immigrants slowly reshaped the narrative. They weren't just surviving in America, they were redefining it. They built the neighborhoods, powered the industries, and diversified the soul of the nation. No, life in America wasn't the dream they had been sold, but it offered something real, the chance to begin again. And for millions, that chance was worth everything. The path to becoming American was paved with resistance. While immigrants brought energy, labor, and diversity to the growing nation, they also faced intense backlash from segments of the population that saw them as a threat. As cities grew and jobs became more competitive, anti-immigrant sentiment spread rapidly. This hostility gave rise to a movement known as Nativism, the belief that America should be preserved for those deemed true Americans, usually Anglo-Saxon, Protestants with long family histories on U.S. soil. This nativist wave wasn't just social, it became political. In the 1850s, a group called the Know Nothing Party gained traction by campaigning on a platform of anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant rhetoric. They feared that the rising numbers of Irish and German Catholics were undermining American values and secretly plotting to give allegiance to the Pope. Though the party eventually collapsed, its influence lingered in the political landscape, planting the seeds of future restrictions. By the late 19th century, hostility became law. One of the most infamous examples was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major federal law to ban an entire ethnic group from immigrating to the United States. Chinese laborers had helped build the Transcontinental Railroad and contributed heavily to the Western economy, but as economic conditions worsened and white workers looked for scapegoats, Chinese communities became targets. The law halted all Chinese immigration and barred Chinese residents from becoming citizens, sparking decades of institutional discrimination and violence. These attitudes weren't limited to Chinese immigrants. Italians, Jews, Poles, and other Eastern and Southern Europeans were often viewed as racially inferior, untrustworthy, or culturally incompatible. Newspaper cartoons depicted them with grotesque features, and politicians openly accused them of bringing crime, disease, and radical politics. In 1924, the U.S. government passed a series of immigration quotas that drastically limited arrivals from non-Western European countries. These laws were rooted in the false science of eugenics and the belief that America needed to protect its stock. Racism and xenophobia became a daily reality. Immigrants were mocked for their accents, targeted by police, and denied jobs or housing based on their nationality. Many changed their names, abandoned traditional dress, or stopped speaking their native languages in public just to avoid conflict. But assimilation was a double-edged sword. While it opened doors, it also meant the slow erosion of identity. The struggle to balance cultural preservation with American integration was deeply personal. Some families clung tightly to old-world traditions, celebrating holidays, cooking traditional meals, teaching children the native tongue, while others encouraged full immersion into American life. Churches, schools, and social clubs became battlegrounds for identity. Should a child attend a public school and lose their heritage, or a private ethnic school and risk isolation? Despite the pressure to conform, immigrants reshaped America in their own image. They brought with them new foods, music, languages, and ideas. Ethnic newspapers and radio stations kept communities informed. Cultural festivals spilled into public life, introducing Americans to everything from Italian feasts to Chinese New Year parades. These traditions didn't fade. They fused into the broader culture, transforming what it meant to be American. Still, the road was never easy. Immigrants had to fight not just for a job or a roof over their heads, but for the right to belong. The challenges they faced were immense, but so was their determination. They may have arrived as outsiders, but over time, through grit and resilience, they helped build the very nation that once tried to shut them out. Amidst the hardship and discrimination, immigrant communities did what they had always done best. They relied on each other. In cities, teeming with uncertainty and unfamiliarity, they built networks of support that became lifelines for survival and progress. These networks took many forms, from informal neighborhood bonds to structured organizations, but they all had one thing in common: they gave people hope. One of the most vital aspects of immigrant resilience was the rise of mutual aid societies. These were grassroots organizations formed by and for immigrants, often organized around a specific nationality, religion, or ethnic group. Members paid small dues into a communal fund that provided help in times of illness, unemployment, or death. At a time when there was no government safety net, these societies acted as a proto-welfare system, offering financial aid, funeral assistance, and even healthcare access. They weren't just charitable organizations. They were proof of solidarity in a society that often refused to see them as equals. Religious institutions played an equally crucial role. Immigrant churches, synagogues, and later mosques weren't just places of worship. They were cultural hubs, social centers, and sanctuaries from discrimination. Inside their walls, immigrants could hear sermons in their native tongues, celebrate familiar holidays, and find guidance from leaders who understood their struggles. Priests, rabbis, and pastors often doubled as counselors, job brokers, or community organizers. Faith offered not just spiritual strength, but tangible support. Education became another powerful pillar. While many immigrant children worked to support their families, parents still valued learning as a path to success. Parochial schools and community-run academies taught both American and native languages, giving children the tools to navigate both worlds. Over time, second-generation immigrants would rise to become teachers, doctors, and business leaders, often returning to help uplift their communities. The spirit of resilience wasn't always grand or heroic. Sometimes it was found in small, daily acts. An Italian grandmother teaching her grandchildren to cook pasta from scratch while telling stories of Naples. A Chinese father running a laundromat 6 days a week so his daughter could go to school. A Polish teenager organizing a union meeting after a 12-hour factory shift. These weren't just survival tactics. They were acts of quiet defiance. Proof that no matter how hard the world pushed them down, they would stand up again and again. Immigrants also found ways to celebrate their heritage openly, even in the face of pressure to assimilate. Cultural festivals, folk dances, traditional clothing, and community theaters helped preserve language, music, and customs. These weren't just nostalgic events. They were declarations of identity. By holding on to who they were, immigrants reshaped the cultural fabric of the United States itself. Even as they struggled against poverty, prejudice, and political exclusion, immigrants created something remarkable: a sense of belonging in a place that didn't always welcome them. Their communities were not just responses to adversity, they were engines of transformation. Through resilience, cooperation, and an unshakable belief in a better future, they turned America into a place that, slowly but surely, began to reflect them back. Their story is not just one of hardship, it's one of strength, of building something lasting amid the rubble of uncertainty. And that resilience continues to echo in immigrant neighborhoods, old and new, across the country today. As the 19th century unfolded, countless immigrants arrived in America with little more than hope and determination. While many toiled in obscurity, a few rose to national prominence, transforming industries, reshaping society, and leaving legacies that endure to this day. But even beyond the famous names, it was the everyday heroes, laborers, artisans, and community organizers who truly helped build the nation from the ground up. One of the most iconic immigrant success stories is that of Andrew Carnegie. Born into poverty in Scotland, Carnegie arrived in America as a young boy in the 1840s. He began working in a cotton factory at age 13, earning just $1.20 a week. But his relentless work ethic and deep belief in self-education propelled him through the ranks. By the 1870s, he had founded the Carnegie Steel Company, revolutionizing the American steel industry and becoming one of the wealthiest men in the world. Yet Carnegie didn't forget his roots. He spent the later part of his life giving away most of his fortune to build libraries, schools, and foundations, promoting the idea that wealth should serve the greater good. Then there's Levi Strauss, a German Jewish immigrant who came to America during the California Gold Rush. Though he never struck gold himself, he created something just as valuable: durable denim pants for miners, later known as blue jeans. Strauss's innovation didn't just change fashion, it helped define the rugged, working-class image of the American West. His brand became a symbol of durability and enterprise, qualities deeply associated with the immigrant experience itself. Another towering figure was Mother Cabrini, born Francesca Cabrini in Italy. She immigrated to the U.S. in 1889 with a mission to help the poorest of the poor, especially fellow Italians. She founded schools, hospitals, and orphanages across the country, bringing care and dignity to those most neglected by society. In 1946, she became the first American citizen to be canonized as a saint, recognized for her tireless humanitarian work and deep spiritual commitment. She showed that greatness didn't always come from wealth or invention. It could also come from compassion. But while these names shine bright in history books, millions of unsung immigrants were just as vital. There were the railroad workers, many of them Chinese, who blasted through mountains and laid tracks across unforgiving terrain. There were the Irish dock workers who loaded ships through backbreaking labor, and the Jewish tailors who stitched garments in sweltering tenement sweatshops. There were the women who ran boarding houses, raised children, took in laundry, and somehow managed to hold their communities together. Their hands may never have held power, but they held purpose. Immigrants also became powerful forces for change in their neighborhoods. They organized unions, started newspapers in their native languages, opened shops and bakeries that brought a taste of home to the streets of New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. These were the small, quiet leaders, the glue of immigrant communities. They weren't remembered by statues or fortune, but by the lives they touched and the futures they made possible. Taken together, these stories paint a picture of extraordinary impact. From industrial giants to the quiet corner grocer, 19th century immigrants didn't just come to America, they shaped it. Their contributions remind us that greatness doesn't always start with a title or a bank account. Sometimes it starts with the courage to cross an ocean, the willingness to work, and the belief that a better life is not only possible, but worth fighting for. By the end of the 19th century, immigration had reshaped the American landscape in every imaginable way. Cities had grown, economies had boomed, and new voices filled the streets with a chorus of languages, traditions, and dreams. The millions who came during this era didn't just adapt to America, they changed it forever. Their influence can be seen in nearly every facet of modern American life. Culturally, they brought their customs, cuisine, music, and holidays, many of which have become part of the American fabric. From bagels and pizza to polka and parades, the country's rich diversity is a direct inheritance from 1800s immigrants who refused to let their identities be erased. They helped define what it means to be American, not through conformity, but through contribution. Economically, these immigrants powered the nation's rise. They built the railroads, worked the mines, staffed the factories, and ran the corner stores. Their labor was the engine of the Industrial Revolution, and their innovation, whether in small family businesses or large-scale enterprises, drove new industries and new ideas. The very infrastructure of modern America, from bridges to neighborhoods to institutions, was often laid down by hands that had crossed oceans to get here. But perhaps most importantly, 19th century immigrants transformed the American identity itself. Before this wave of migration, the country was still finding its voice. These newcomers helped shape that voice into something broader, more inclusive, however imperfectly. They challenged the nation to live up to its ideals, not just for the privileged few, but for everyone willing to believe in possibility and work for a better life. In doing so, they created a legacy of perseverance and hope that still echoes in today's immigration stories. And while the policies and politics around immigration have changed over the centuries, the core journey remains timeless. People leaving behind everything they know for the chance at something more, for freedom, for opportunity, for a place to call their own. That story didn't end in the 1800s. It continues every day. So as we close this journey through 19th century immigration, ask yourself, where does your family's story begin? Maybe it started in Ireland, Italy, China, Poland, or somewhere else entirely. Maybe you're the first generation to step foot on American soil. Whatever your roots, they are part of a much larger narrative. One that built a nation not just with bricks and steel, but with dreams and determination. Because at its heart, the story of immigration is the story of America. And the next chapter? That's still being written by people like you. Thanks for watching this journey through the lives and legacies of 19th century immigrants who helped shape America. If this story resonated with you, give it a like. And if you've got a family immigration story, whether it's from 5 generations ago or just last year, drop it in the comments. We'd love to hear where your roots began. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that built our world. And stick around. Next week, we're exploring another powerful chapter in American history, the Great Migration. Millions of Black Americans left the Jim Crow South in search of freedom and opportunity, forever changing the face of American cities, culture, and politics. You won't want to miss it. Until then, thanks for being part of the story.